Como Skype.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. Bruce before asked me, my name is Tom McMahon, to introduce my dear friend Peter Rogers. And I would think, and by the way, his lovely wife Carol. And I would think most people here are familiar with Peter. He's had a huge transition in his work over the years. And he's here, to my knowledge, to explain it. And I look forward to it. I have the book that he has written regarding the work. I've gone through it, but I personally haven't heard him verbalize it, so I'm looking forward to it. And also, I might add, and I know this, you probably don't want me to say this, but in our country, we have what is called the National Academy, and that is the pinnacle of recognition of art success. Peter is a member of the World Academy that is located in Great Britain, is it not?
I've never heard of it.
You are a member of the Royal Academy.
The Royal Academy?
Yeah.
No, the Royal Society of British Artists. I resigned actually a long time ago.
I'm not going to get into that. But in any event, it's an honorarium that's very important. And the comparison is, again, to our National Academy here. So with not further ado, Peter Rogers.
I'm going to have to read to you, I'm afraid. I know people hate being read to and far rather to try and speak off the cuff and make a fool of yourself. But this is too complicated, what I have to say. And I really have to, this is the only way I can really do it. When I was fresh out of art school, I read a book called A New Model of the Universe by the Russian philosopher and mystic, Peter Uspensky. In it, he spoke of the four ways of the spiritual life of humanity. There were two intellectual ways, science and philosophy, and two emotional ways, religion and art. Speaking of art, he said that art is a definite way of knowledge, and he underlined those words. The artist in creating, he wrote, learns much that he did not know before. But an art which does not reveal mysteries, which does not lead to the sphere of the unknown, with a capital U, does not yield new knowledge, is a parody of art, and still more often, it is not even a parody, but simply a commerce or an industry. Those were sobering words, and I was lucky to read them when I myself was just setting out to be an artist. To me, they rang true. They were also reassuring, because my sights were already set in the direction he advocated. And in the event, my art has been a way of knowledge. It has revealed mysteries. And as we shall see, it has also led to the sphere of the unknown. I say all this by way of introduction, because I do not want you to be surprised by the fact that most of what I shall be saying will have to do with spiritual matters. Art, as Uspensky said, is one of the four ways of the spiritual life of humanity. Nevertheless, I can imagine some of you thinking, what is all this? Some sort of sermon? I hope it doesn't come across that way. All I want to do is prove to you that Uspensky knew what he was talking about. Now, before I go any further, I should point out something important. The subject of this talk concerns imagery. It is about what I paint. It does not go into how I paint or the creative process. The creative process is itself a way of knowledge. And I mention this fact because I do not want you to jump to the conclusion that in order to fulfill Uspensky's dictum one necessarily has to paint spiritual subject matter. This is not the case. One can paint anything at all, and it can still be a way of knowledge, just as Ouspensky defined it. But since the reasons why would require another talk altogether, it is not something I can address today. That said, I can begin the story of my own quest for meaningful subject matter. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Beth Dufour concerning the 6 paintings you see here. She wrote, as you can surely understand, I receive comments daily on how intriguing your work is, and of course, explanations are requested. Now this is easier said than done, for the whole subject is rather complex. I call the series Images of the Way, and they have to do with the quest for enlightenment. The images themselves and their meaning have evolved slowly over the last 57 years, and only very recently have I made some critical discoveries. These days, whenever I make such discoveries, I put them in writing as soon as possible, so that I don't forget them. Being rather old, my memory is not what it was. What got into me I do not know, but with no particular end in view. I found myself writing an updated version of the story of how the imagery evolved and what it has come to mean to me. Having finished it, I called it A Story Worth Telling, and that is the story I shall be telling you today. When it comes to the explanations requested, it is certainly a case of overkill, but having written this paper, I thought that this would be a good opportunity to make use of it. I only hope that you will agree that it is a story worth telling, but I warn you that we shall be getting into some pretty deep water. Insofar as I'm known at all as a painter, it is probably for the far larger series of paintings that I call The Quest, the series that involves a man and a woman, a horse, a dove, a comet, angels, forests, pools of water, storms and cataclysms. I've painted many versions of this story. It too is about the quest for enlightenment, but it tells the story from a human perspective, whereas the series I call Images of the Way tells it from the perspective of our own gods and goddesses. I shall explain what I mean by that in due course. I have also painted many versions of the Images of the Way. The series you have here was painted in the year 2000, but 6 years later I tried to rework the figures of the 3 men in the first painting in an attempt to make them look more horrid. In the event, I only succeeded in wrecking the painting, and in the end I scrapped it. Fortunately, I have a photo of the painting as it was originally, and since I now cannot see anything wrong with it, I've framed the photo, and it is now hung with the 6 paintings that still survive. There are 3 parts to this talk. To begin with, and as part 1, I shall be telling you about how the Images of the Way evolved. This I feel is important because I want you to know that it was not anything I thought up. It came through rather than from me, and in all manner of unexpected ways. After a break, I shall be talking about the imagery itself. What it ended up teaching me is quite extraordinary. It is information that I hope to pass on to you. And incidentally, to those of you who were present when I gave that talk last year at the Retreat Center in San Patricio, I must apologize, because much of what I shall be saying you will have heard before. You may well wonder how and why I ever became so obsessed with the subject of enlightenment. I shall tell you. It all began when I was 23, and late one night I heard a voice telling me to seek the kingdom of heaven. It was, of course, what Jesus told us to do. No doubt more people would take his advice seriously if they too heard a disembodied voice like I did. As it was, I took it very seriously indeed. I felt that God had spoken to me, and even though I had no idea what seeking the kingdom of heaven really meant, I would seek it anyway, and find out what it was all about along the way. And that is how my own spiritual quest began. Precisely when I began to realize that seeking the kingdom of heaven is a metaphor for the quest for enlightenment, and it all has to do with evolving consciousness, I cannot say, but it must have been right around the time I left art school, which was in 1956. Nothing seemed to me as important as the evolution of consciousness. The future of life on earth seemed to depend on it. So for me, setting out as a professional painter, that is what I intended to paint. I had set myself quite a problem. I was only too aware of my own ignorance. So how on earth was I to say anything of any value about evolving consciousness when spiritually I myself was still groping in the dark? I'd been brought up in the Church of England, and throughout all my church-going days, I do not remember anyone ever talking about seeking the kingdom of heaven. Perhaps no one ever did, because no one knew how to. However, thanks to that voice, I now had that desire firmly planted in consciousness, and it seems the desire was enough, because it was not long before I made some startling discoveries. The first picture I painted on leaving art school was a 10-foot crucifixion. It was based on the evidence of the Turin Shroud, photographs of which had just been made public for the first time. At the foot of the cross, a huddled group of 3 Roman soldiers diced for Christ's robe. I was at that age when one is more sensitive to and more outraged by the suffering and injustice in the world than is the case later in life. The Hungarian uprising in 1956 and its brutal suppression shocked me deeply. What had happened had been evil in the extreme, and as an artist I wanted to express my sense of outrage. In the event, however, I found myself at a loss, because I had no wish to be a political painter like the Mexican muralists. I found that the best I could do was make a statement about evil in general, and in order to do that, I made use of the group of 3 soldiers from my crucifixion composition. I removed them from that context and tried to make them look like the very personification of evil. I called these pictures images of evil, and there were many of them. If God is good and all-powerful, how can he allow all the evil and suffering in the world? To anyone believing in an almighty God, the existence of evil presents a problem. If by painting all these images of evil, I thought I might come to an understanding of the problem, I did not. Instead, I eventually became fed up painting all these negative images and decided to paint a positive image for a change, something that was the absolute opposite of an image of evil. But what was the opposite? Somehow I knew it wasn't an image of good. There was something inherently weak about unalloyed goodness, and the positive image had to be at least as strong as the negative. In any case, goodness was impossible to paint. Was the answer an image of God? Equally impossible to paint. I was stuck. I was rescued from my dilemma by hearing a voice for the second time. I'd been reading a book by Krishnamurti. I'd never read anything about mysticism before, and the book amazed and excited me. I was reading about our oneness with God and how all human suffering is due to our belief in a state of being separate from God. Had I had my wits about me, I might have realized that the solution to the problem concerning the positive image I was looking for lay in what I was reading. As it was, I needed to be metaphorically hit on the head before I got the point. And this hit on the head came while I was standing in the corridor of a train travelling by night between Edinburgh and London. I was alone in the corridor when I heard 2 phrases spoken as if by someone standing just a few feet away. They were the illusion of separateness, the understanding of oneness. I do not think it took me long to get the point. After all, the problem I confronted in my painting had been in the back of my mind for weeks. Had I now been given the solution? What if those images of evil were to be seen anew as images of the illusion of separateness? The implications of this idea were, of course, immense. What happens to the power of evil if it is merely the fruit of an illusion? If evil is the outcome of a belief in a state of being separate from God, and if this state of separation is illusory, it follows that the power of evil, in spite of all appearances to the contrary, had to be illusory too. This idea took me quite some time to digest, but one thing was certain: there was no longer any problem regarding a positive image. It had been handed to me on a plate. Back in my London studio, I painted another version of the three men of the negative image. The big difference being that they no longer looked like a frightening source of power. Instead, they looked blind, stupid, and ignorant, for they now personified nothing more threatening than a sinister illusion. I then confronted the problem of how to paint the understanding of oneness. And this was indeed a problem. In the end, at a loss for a better solution, I simply painted three figures outward instead of inward facing, and female instead of male. I knew this was arbitrary, but it was the best I could do. At least visually, it was the opposite of the separateness image. However, as an image of the understanding of oneness, it left much to be desired, or so I thought. Now, while working on this painting, I happened to be reading Robert Graves' The White Goddess. And since I'll be quoting Robert Graves several times, I hope to say something about him. I don't know if you know or not, but he was one of England's greatest poets. He survived the whole of the First World War as an infantry officer, which was something of a miracle. On average, an infantry officer could expect to survive for 3 weeks on the Western Front before he was either killed or injured. And Robert Graves lasted the whole war, after which he became the famous poet that we know, and an absolutely remarkable scholar. His knowledge of the mythologies of the world is encyclopedic, and his book, The White Goddess, a very important book, which did an immense amount to reintroduce the whole idea of the feminine and the divine. I suppose he's best known, Robert Graves, for his historical novel, I, Claudius, from which a brilliant TV series was made for Masterpiece Theatre. Anyhow, okay, so I was working on this attempt to paint the understanding of oneness, and I was reading this book. And I just finished the painting when I came upon the fact that the original three muses of Greek myth were meditation, memory, and song. This was disconcerting because the three women I just painted appear to illustrate these muses almost to perfection. The middle figure sat on the ground, cross-legged, hands in lap, facing the viewer, the very personification of meditation. The figure on the left sat with her back to the viewer, as though looking back into the past, and hence suggested with no memory, while the woman on the right, looking off to the right and reclining inward, would well have symbolized song had I but opened her mouth. It seemed that I painted the three muses by accident. But the three muses were not what I wanted to paint. I failed to see that they had anything to do with oneness, and since this surprising case of synchronicity had rather taken the wind out of my sails, I gave up trying to paint the understanding of oneness and went on to other things. The Quest series was beginning to evolve. was now living in New Mexico, having moved from England to America in 1963. While my outer life was utterly different, my inner life went on as before. I'd long felt that there was an undue emphasis on the masculine in Christianity, and so it had been refreshing for me when I'd read The White Goddess. By the time I was living in America, she had become part of my repertoire of imagery. As the great triple goddess of antiquity, she was maiden, mother, and old crone, and had been associated with spring, summer, and fall, winter. Every year, the so-called god of the waxing year would be born in the spring and die in the fall, only to be resurrected again the following spring. For poets and artists, the maiden aspect of the goddess was the muse, and I should say still is. The imagery of the crest developed bit by bit like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together. The three men of the separate image were always part of the story. Sometimes I painted them huge in size and solid looking, and sometimes as a mirage, according to the evolving sensibility of the man and woman of the story. The triple goddess featured in the story too, all three goddesses assisting the quest in a positive way, even the old crone, who, apart from personifying memory, is the equivalent of Kali, the sinister destroyer goddess of Hinduism. The role of the crone, however, is to destroy the ego, the main stumbling block to progress on the quest. So the part she plays is in fact vital and not sinister at all. Then, in 1978, a friend lent me a copy of a book by the Tibetan Buddhist Chogyam Trungpa. In it I discovered that his countrymen account for the world as we perceive it by saying that it's the work of the three lords of materialism. These three lords are mind, speech, and form. They symbolize our own minds and our own speech, which together create our own reality, i.e. form. As I thought about this discovery, I suddenly remembered the fact that the three muses whom I had painted by accident back in 1960 had been meditation, memory, and song. Mind, speech, and form. Meditation, memory, and song. Were the two triads in fact symbiotic? Because the effect of meditation on mind is obvious. When the first muse, meditation, is allowed to work her transformative magic on the first law of mind, the doors to eventual enlightenment are opened. It now dawned on me not only that the three men of the illusion of separateness were now for the first time individually identified, but that my accidental painting of the three muses had been no accident at all. Meditation, memory, and song symbolizing the means by which we come to the understanding of oneness. It had taken 18 years for my conscious understanding to finally catch up with the highly purposeful activity of my unconscious. I eventually began to see the lords and muses as our personal gods and goddesses, for their activity determines our state of consciousness, and our state of consciousness determines our life experience. Our life experience, and that of the human race as a whole, is such as it is because the first Lord, mind, is still the Lord of materialism. Clearly, if we want a world rid of suffering, universal mind has to evolve, and the only way it can do so is through the auspices of the muses. This can only happen one person at a time. There is no other way. In 1983, I made a trip to England, and while there I was asked to give a talk at a meeting of the Society for Spiritual and Psychological Studies. I spoke about the lords and muses and told very much the same story as I have told here. I showed slides. I could only take the lords' muses imagery as far as showing the lords by themselves and the muses by themselves. And the image of the lords was negative in the extreme. Up until now, I've been unable to figure out how to depict their evolution. However, as luck would have it, at this meeting, there was a mathematical physicist by the name of Glenn Schaefer. He headed the Ecological Physics Group at the Cranfield Institute of Technology. After the meeting broke up, he told me that what I had been saying paralleled the latest thinking in physics. This, of course, amazed and intrigued me. Feeling that we still had a lot to say to each other, we arranged to meet later in London, which we did, and we travelled up to Cranfield together by train. Over dinner at his home, I confessed my inability to take the Lord's Muses imagery any further, whereupon, and without a pause, he said, "But my dear fellow, the answer's obvious. You've got to get the girls and boys together." I knew at once that he was right, and felt rather stupid that I had not thought of this myself. However, since I had no intention of altering their relative positions, I was far from certain that the two groups would integrate successfully. In the event they did. When on my return to New Mexico, I tackled the problem on a large canvas. They fell into place as though they were meant to go together, as indeed I'm sure they were. I have painted many versions of the Lords and Muses united, but only recently did my son David point out something that I'd never noticed before. In all these paintings, the placement of the three muses makes a rough inverted triangle. I think you can see it in all of them, actually. You can see a rough inverted triangle. Whereas the placement of the three lords makes an upright triangle. Most obvious in the first one, but an upright triangle in all of them. Where are we? When the two are united, these two triangles, they make a Star of David. And the Star of David symbolizes the union of opposites. The Lords and Muses united, insofar as they unite the male and female principles, symbolize the union of opposites too. Then my son went on to show me that the light in the lantern held aloft by the hermit in the tarot deck is also a Star of David, making the point that the Star of David is a symbol of illumination by a spiritual illumination. And so is the image of the Lords and Muses united. Their union symbolizes the goal of the quest, which is, of course, enlightenment. Included, and what I'm talking about here is really just the final image. I hadn't invented all these other ones yet. Previously, I just had the image of the Lords by themselves and the Muses by themselves. Then we suddenly jumped all the way to the end and had the Lords and Muses united. Included in all the different versions of this image is what I call the channel of awareness. The channel of awareness equates to the Christ. I shall try to explain why. The Christ is, of course, the second person of the Trinity, or the Logos, which means the Word. St. John began his Gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Was he talking about Jesus? For many years I didn't think he could have been. But the fact is that he was. Hard though it be for us to understand. John, speaking of Jesus again, said, "He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us." In Eastern religions, Jesus would have been called an avatar. There have been several manifestations on earth, for instance, of the Hindu god Vishnu, who with Brahma and Shiva formed part of the Hindu trinity. The eighth and principal avatar of Vishnu was Krishna. My dictionary defines avatar as the descent to earth of a deity in human form. And that is clearly what St. John was talking about with regard to Jesus. Jesus was the manifestation on earth of the second person of our Christian Trinity, I, the Son of God, the Christ,